Hey everyone, welcome to How to Play Warhammer 40K 7th Edition. As always, my name is Jay, and today I will be discussing preparing for the battle. Today I'll be going over terrain types, how to put as much terrain as you want on the battlefield, and all the rules that you need to do ahead of time before the game starts, so to establish the rules and to get the game going. So it's going to be a lot of fun, and after today's episode we'll be starting to play the game, so it's going to be a great time ahead. So let's start off with terrain. Now, Warhammer 40K 7th Edition is played on a 6 foot by 4 foot table, as you can see here. And the best battles have terrain on them. One of the most frequent questions I get is, how much terrain should I have on the battlefield? From personal experience, the better games tend to have more terrain. And just the more terrain you put on the field, typically, the more fun and the more interesting the games get, because the more strategy will come into your game. Now, I recommend as a minimum having at least 25% of your battlefield covered in terrain. And I should be mentioning that all the terrain that you're going to be seeing in this video, well, most of it at least, was created by Greenleaf Terrain. So go check out Greenleaf Terrain at greenleafterrain.com. They make amazing terrain for your battlefield, and I think you'll really enjoy them. I love having their terrain on my tabletop, and I love the games that they produce. And as I said, there's actually no correct amount of terrain that you need on your field, but here's what I recommend. Number one, as I said, at least 25% of your tabletop being covered in terrain. One of the easiest ways to know what percentage of your table is actually covered in terrain is simply take all your pieces, like so, and clump them in a corner, and see how much of your battlefield do the terrain pieces actually take up. As you can see here, they take up roughly a quarter of the table in this particular case. A second recommendation that I recommend for you guys when looking at terrain is mix up the types of terrain. Try to use some hills, which can block some line of sight and give a 5-up cover save to those behind it. Try to incorporate some trees. Trees and forest are a great little cover save as well. They provide a 5+ cover saves, and I will be going over cover saves in a future video, so don't worry about that. Forests, as I said, break up the battlefield. And finally, ruins. Ruins are my favorite terrain piece type in Warhammer 40K 7th Edition because they do have that futuristic Armageddon feel to them. They're ruins. They display a battlefield, you know, and they provide a 4-up cover save typically for models inside them. So as I said, at least 25% of your table. I usually like between 25% and a third, so a quarter to a third of the table covered in terrain. I like to mix up my terrain types so they provide different types of cover saves and provide different types of strategy. And finally, the next part that I want to cover is where to put your pieces on the battlefield, on your tabletop. Now, there's several ways that you can create your tablescape for your game Warhammer 40K 7th Edition. The first way is just do a quick mirror image. Make sure that both sides are relatively even in amount of terrain. Now, this might be a boring game, or this might be a fair game, depending on how you and your opponents stack up. What it does is it typically removes the way that the terrain will interact with the game, and so the game will not necessarily depend on the terrain itself, but it will provide cover saves to those models that need it. Another way of setting up the table is setting up an epic cinematic feel to the table. So that way it's very asymmetric, the amount of terrain, as you can see here, but it has that feel like a squad is attacking a village or an army is coming forth to a citadel and going to try to destroy it. This can lead to very epic and scenic and really fun games of Warhammer 40K 7th Edition. A third way is just do it randomly. Take a dice, roll the amount for every quarter of the table or every 1/6 of the table, every 2x2 square of the table, as you can see here, and decide that way. Roll a d6 divided by 2, so you get a d3, and put that many pieces in the battlefield. This will lead to a really sporadic, random table, but it could be really fun and have some really great strategies involved, and it will really break up the monotony of a game of Warhammer 40K. So, here's a quick summarization. I recommend having at least a quarter to a third of your table covered in terrain. I recommend mixing up the types of terrain as to get different cover saves and different feel over the field. And finally, there's no really best way of setting up your tabletop. Do however you wish. Do it asymmetrical, symmetrical if you wish, or in a really cool, scenic, epic feel. It'll create a really good story and help drive a really fun game of 40K. So, Now that the table is completely set up to your liking, it is time to talk about the other parts that you need to establish before the game of Warhammer 40K can begin. The first one is you have to compare lists with your opponent. I always recommend showing your army to your opponent, telling them what you have, not necessarily what you're going to do with them. You don't have to give away your entire strategy, but make sure that your opponent is completely familiar with your army and at least what you have and which transports are and what guys are what transports and so forth. The next important piece after showing your army to your opponent is establishing your warlord. Each army has to have a warlord, and the warlord is typically the leader of your army. They are a very special model. You get to choose now who you want to be the warlord. Now, one of the big changes between 6th edition and 7th edition was, in 6th edition, the warlord had to be an HQ model. In 6th edition, therefore, only the leaders could be warlords. But now in 7th edition, any character model, and now the way to tell if your model is a character is just look at the unit type at the end of the stat line. It will say CH for character. Any character can be your warlord in Warhammer 40K 7th edition. Now typically most people will still keep the warlords as their HQs, but you can make it a sergeant or an orc knob, as you can see here, or just any character model you choose. And by choosing that model to be the warlord, you're going to be giving a special rule to that particular model. Plus, it will become your opponent's objective to kill that model. One of the secondary objectives in Warhammer 40K is called Slay the Warlord. And Slay the Warlord means if I kill your warlord during the game, I get a point. And points obviously do matter in the game, so it might help you win the game. So you're going to try to kill your opponent's warlord, and your opponent's going to try to kill your warlord. So after you've chosen who's going to be your warlord in this game, it's time to give them a warlord trait. Now, how do you get a warlord trait? First, you choose a warlord traits table. There are 3 tables in the Warhammer 40K rulebook. They are the strategic traits, the personal traits, and the command traits. Also, any 6th or 7th edition codex will also have a separate warlord traits table that is typically tailored more towards your army. Most people do end up taking the warlord trait from their individual codex, but you can choose between the one in your codex, so your warlord trait for your specific army, or any of the 3 warlord trait tables that I've just mentioned right here. After you've chosen a warlord trait table, you take a dice and you roll it. And each number of the dice is associated with a specific trait in that specific warlord trait table. Pretty simple stuff. So, for example, if I went ahead and chose the command traits warlord trait, and I roll my dice and I get a 1, like so, I would be giving myself Inspiring Presence, which friendly units within 12 inches of the warlord can use his leadership rather than their own. That means that guys around my warlord will have a better leadership and will not likely fall back when taking morale checks. That's great stuff. So as I said, that's if I chose the command traits and I rolled a 1 on the command traits warlord table. The next set of rules that you will need to accomplish before playing a game of Warhammer 40K is to roll for the special powers or psychic powers of your army, depending on if you have any. The most frequently rolled ones are psychic powers. Now, for every psyker you bring in your army, you will most likely have to roll for their psychic powers. Now, there are many different psychic power tables. There's usually one in each individual codex for an army. For example, orcs and tyranids have their own psychic powers that they have to roll from those specific tables. Other armies, like Space Marines, have access to multiple different psychic powers, and there's different psychic power tables. So ahead of time you have to choose which type, and then you roll once again a d6 for each psychic power that you want your psyker to learn. And once you roll that number, you can always have the option of taking the Primaris power. For each psychic discipline, there is a Primaris power that instead you can substitute for whichever role you want. That being said, if your psyker takes all the same psychic powers from the same psychic discipline, so for example, if I'm playing a Tyranid army and they roll all their psychic powers from Powers of the Hive Mind, their psychic powers, they automatically achieve the Primaris power for free. So they get to know an extra psychic power. That's pretty cool stuff there. So as I mentioned, so ahead of time, you have to choose what psychic disciplines you want to roll on. You can take actual different psychic powers from different psychic disciplines. So let's do an example. Here is a level 2 librarian for the Dark Angels army. Now if you take the codex for Dark Angels and you look under the librarian, you'll see that Dark Angel librarian has access to divination, pyromancy, telepathy, and the telekinesis disciplines. So because he's a level 2, I get 2 psychic powers for the specific librarian, and I can choose any of those 4 disciplines to roll on. Now I can roll both psychic powers from the same discipline, or I can choose 2 different disciplines and roll each. Just make sure to say exactly which discipline you want to roll on ahead of time before rolling the dice. So, just to summarize psychic powers, for each psyker that you have in your army, they might have access to rolling for psychic powers. Now look under those specific rules for that specific model in their codex, and you'll find out if they get to roll for any psychic powers. Next, just choose which discipline you want to roll on that they have access to, and you attach that specific dice roll to the specific psychic power associated with that dice roll from 1 to 6. And that way you get to assign your psychic powers to your psychers before the game begins. The next several rolls that you need to accomplish before a game of Warhammer 40K begin. The first one is, what game are you actually playing? What is the mission type? Now you and your opponent can decide on a specific mission type ahead of the game, or you decide to roll on a dice and see what mission type you get. Now before that, you have to decide whether or not you want to play the Eternal War missions or the Maelstrom of War missions. The Eternal War missions are the basic missions of Warhammer 40K 7th edition. They are typically the best for beginners and intermediate players. The Maelstrom War missions involve cards and a deck of cards, and you have to accomplish certain objectives at certain times throughout the game. So they tend to be a little more towards the intermediate and advanced players for Warhammer 40K 7th edition. Once you decide between the two, you roll a d6 and attach that number once again to the specific mission type. So for example, if I choose Eternal War, the basic missions, and I roll a 2, that is Purge the Alien. And Purge the Alien means we're playing kill points, which I will be going over all these missions in a future video to clear up any problems that people have with them in a future video. The next role that you need to decide is deployment type. There are 3 different deployment types in Warhammer 40K 7th edition. The first one is the standard deployment type known as Dawn of War. Dawn of War uses a 6 foot by 1 foot deployment zone along the long edges of your table, as you can see here, mapped out by these dice. So basically it is the standard sides, and you each get a foot on each side as your deployment zone. Now I will be going over the next video, we'll actually be covering deployment and reserve, so I will be going over this with extreme detail. The next deployment type is Hammer and Anvil, which is basically table sides. It's the opposite deployment side orientation, so you're actually going over the short edges of the table, and it is a 4 foot by 2 foot deployment zone. Please take into consideration that in both of these examples, you start 24 inches away from your opponent. The final type of deployment is known as the Vanguard Strike, in which you actually use table corners as your deployment zone, as mapped out by the dice in this example. As you can see on this table, it's actual table corners. Now, once you've rolled to see who goes first, they choose a specific corner, and then the opponent obviously deploys in the opposite corner of the table. When rolling for deployment type, you roll a d6, so 1 dice. On 1 or 2, it is Dawn of War. On a 3 or 4, it is Hammer and Anvil. And on a 5 or 6, the answer is Vanguard Strike. So now you know what deployment type, and you know the mission. So the final roll you need to roll ahead of time is for night fighting. And what night fighting essentially does is it gives everyone a better cover save in the very first turn of the game. Now you don't actually have to play with night fighting if you don't want to. So discuss night fighting with your opponent. If at least one of you wants to include night fighting in the game, you roll a dice. And on a 4+, night fighting is in existence during the first turn of the game, and on a 3 or less, no night fighting for the game. Once again, I will be going over this in future videos. So that's it. Now you're aware of the mission. You know the deployment type, and you know whether or not there's going to be night fighting. So there's one more final roll off between you and your opponent. You each roll a dice, and whoever has the higher number can choose to deploy first or second. Now, the person who gets to deploy first most likely will end up going first. And the person who deploys second will most likely go second unless they seize the initiative, which I will be discussing in the next video. So basically, if I roll higher than you, I get to choose whether or not I want to deploy first and just get my army to go first, essentially, or should I deploy second and I can deploy counter to you and I'll be able to counter you a little bit better, but I get to go second. So there's pros and cons to each one, and it depends on your specific strategy and your specific army. So, I really hope you enjoyed this episode of How to Play Warhammer 40K 7th Edition. So let's summarize everything that we've gone through this video. First of all, terrain. As I mentioned, you should have a good amount of terrain on your battlefield and mix up the types of terrain. Before the game, make sure to compare lists with your opponent, that way you know what's in each other's lists. Nominate your warlord and choose the warlord trait table, and then roll on it to establish the warlord trait for your warlord for this game. Also roll for any psychic powers by choosing a discipline that they have access to and rolling on those tables for the specific psychic power. And we'll be going over psychic powers in a future video dedicated to the psychic phase. Then all you need to do is roll for the mission type. First you choose between Eternal War and Maelstrom War missions. Roll on a d6 and attach that number to the specific number associated with the that specific table. Next you choose deployment type. You roll on dice again on a 1 or 2, Dawn of War, 3 or 4, Hammer and Anvil, 5 or 6, Vanguard Strike. And then you roll for night fighting if you want, and then roll to see who goes first or who deploys first. And that's it. So now we're completely set up and we're ready to go for a game of Warhammer 40K 7th Edition. So the next episode will be covering deployment and reserves, and then after that, it's game time. So thank you very much for watching this episode of How to Play Warhammer 40K 7th Edition. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a comment in the comment section down below if you felt I missed anything, or if you want to add to this discussion. Everything is greatly appreciated. So stay tuned for more videos. Until next time, this is Jay saying, happy painting.